to another episode of GovTech Today. I'm Russell Lowery.
And I'm Jen Saha.
And together we try and bridge the gap between .com and .gov. Well, is there ever a bigger gap than when we're talking legislation and policy? Obviously, you've got the government on one side. At least one person in the government has thought it was a good idea and submitted a bill or a proposal, and the business community or the public responds to it. But today we've got both regulatory movement, some big things happening in the procurement space on Gen AI, and then the legislature, lots of bills focused on Gen AI, but a couple have risen to the surface as kind of the major bills. So do we want to start with the legislation or start with the regulation?
Let's maybe start with the legislation then go, to the impacts, right?
Okay, so you've got Senator Wiener, he's got his bill, and Assemblywoman Bauer Kahn has another one, and they deal with different areas. Let's start with the broader one first. What's the status on Senator Wiener's bill?
So it was up for a hearing this week, and my understanding, I only caught bits and pieces of it, but my understanding is that it was pretty contentious. There was a ton of discussion around it. Maybe you can kind of highlight some of that discussion for us.
Well, the business community, the basic argument was that it didn't work. It was unworkable, ungovernable, too detailed for too broad to accomplish what the author was trying to accomplish. And then there was a wide-ranging discussion with the committee members who were mostly concerned about the federal government preemption or other issues that weren't really contained in the bill. And they seemed pretty comfortable admitting to the fact that they didn't really understand AI, or were they competent to legislate in the area. And then that was the gist of the discussion that I picked up on.
I think it's funny. I mean, we've even discussed that issue about the federal government preempting, and now we have the European Union preempting too, right? They are putting AI guidance and framework in place over there. So something that we've picked up on in a number of cases, right? Like, do we really need to forge a new path out here as California, or can we wait a few months and let the feds figure it out first?
I thought Senator Wiener did a good job of answering that objection. He brought up a funny example, but the net neutrality example, and just saying, if they want to preempt at some later date, they can occupy the field. Our acting doesn't preclude the feds from acting. But they haven't been able to act despite a bipartisan consensus that action is required. And so California should act if we can, and then defer if we have to. And I think that is likely to go. We've talked in the past about different legislative strategies, and I think in order to get Congress to act, you're probably going to need conflicting or competing state action in order to drive federal action. I'm not sure other states are just going to cede the playing field to California.
I mean, I think a general theme, and this is true of Wiener's legislation as well as Bauer Kahn's, is really protecting the public, making sure that AI isn't being used in the wrong ways, and that there are really clear guardrails up for how government and the public are going to be using AI in California, which I think unanimously everyone agrees there does need to be some type of guardrail, and there does need to be a protection out there. I think what it's really going to come down to is like, where in that industry way over on this side and the legislature way over on this side, where is that middle ground that we can get something, or can we get something that's acceptable to all parties? I mean, what does your gut tell you on that?
I think the governor is going to weigh in heavily here. I think there are some areas that require legislative attention. And the public and the legislature are highly motivated. And I think Bauer Kahn's getting at some of that when she's aiming at bias. Nobody wants discriminatory uh, technology to negatively impact people. And there's a consensus that we need to do something on that. And then I think there are political consequences around labor. And so both for creative artists and plagiarism and some of the issues surrounding that, how are those employees going to be handled? And then job displacement, which is a, a different, related question, uh, is something that, a progressive legislature, union jobs, state employees, are people going to lose jobs because of Gen AI? I think the legislature and the governor will weigh in on that subject. But when I look at the Wiener bill and you say something like you have to design it so that it can't do harm, I can't make a pen that can't do harm. And if it's vague and broad, and I'm always skeptical when these amazing companies tell you it can't be done. Like you don't get to there's a lot of things you can do with the law, but you can't write a law that makes people do something they can't do. And that's where I think we are today with the Wiener bill. But he's a smart legislator, and I was trying to listen to where he was going and and say, okay, he's going to try and land at some place that works, and whether he can do that or not is going to be something that'll have everybody's interest for the rest of the year.
I think you're right that the administration does have a really substantial role to play here. I mean, ultimately, and I love it when, a legislator will get way out on an issue and it's like, this still has to be signed at the end of the day. But I hope like cooler heads, cooler minds prevail. You're right. There was a ton of comments on labor issues, union issues. But ultimately, I mean, my take on all of this, I'm kind of the mindset that we shouldn't rush into this. This is something that's going to impact California and, frankly, our future and our standing in the nation for many years to come. And I know the feds are doing a ton of work in this area. Their Department of Commerce is putting out a lot of new rules. So it does feel like we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here in California. And I respect that. We're California. We should be first. We should set the tone. I'm not sure, though, as it's currently written, that this is the tone that we necessarily want to set. I think there does need to be a lot of compromise and a lot of definition around some of these terms, like causing harm. Great example. So more to come on this. The bill is certainly not dead. It was acknowledged, though, that it needs some work. So I think that work is what we're all interested in seeing how it happens.
I mentioned bias and labor. I think another one where there's broad consensus and we might need to tighten things up are on privacy. No one wants their data exposed to private language models, and how are we going to protect and enable technology without surrendering our privacy? And so I would expect to see legislative action on those three, and I would expect, if I'm prognosticating, that the big, broad, general regulation stuff dies. But the governor and the legislature may be in some different positions. We've seen the governor take action on Gen I and release an executive order that kind of ordered state agencies to consider how it might be used, take steps to discuss how it might be used. And that order seemed pretty forward-thinking and expansive. But some new regulations have come out that that
So
seem
let's
to
not call them
contradict it.
regulations
Yes,
because
what
they
I-
didn't go through the whole regulatory process.
Right.
Semantics.
Guidance.
Yes, actually, that's exactly.
Okay.
It's called Gen AI guidelines.
Guidelines.
Those were released out of our Department of Technology. And this was a part of the executive order. You're right. The governor directed his Department of General Services and GovOps and CDT to get together and release some guidelines, some guidance to state departments on how they should procure generative AI, how they should evaluate use cases. What are we looking at here? So I think one of the most important things that came out of this most recent guidance is actually a definition of generative AI, right? So what was really clear is that when we're talking about AI versus generative AI, generative AI for state government use is defined by CDT and DGS as a pre-trained AI models that can generate images, videos, audio, text, and derived synthetic content. Generative AI does this by analyzing the structure and characteristics of the input data to generate new synthetic content similar to the original. So it also is really clear about what generative AI isn't, which is also really helpful because I think there is a lot of confusion. Do I have to ask permission for this? Is this considered generative AI? Decision support, machine learning, natural language processing, translation services, computer vision, and chatbot technologies are not generative AI on their own.
Ah.
So that's helpful, right? If I'm a department and I've been using those things, I've been kind of unsure. Like,
Right.
is my chatbot considered generative AI? I'm not really sure. This gives it some definition, and they establish a mechanism to double check. Right? I'm not quite sure. I'm gonna put in some questions into this mailbox at CDT, and I'll be able to find out if this is generative AI or not. If it is generative AI, it triggers a number of new requirements on state departments before they can purchase that generative AI solution. I think what's kind of a bummer, to be honest with you, they've instituted a risk assessment. And this risk assessment, I was just looking over it, is 18 pages long. The departments are going to have to do it in cooperation with the vendors that are bidding these solutions. It asks very specific information about data sources, what these systems have done to address bias. And they're also going to have to consult with CDT when they're doing these risk assessments. That will be required for every generative AI purchase that a state department or agency makes.
Do you think when you read through the regulation, through the guidance, do you think it's enough of a hurdle that an agency who is inclined to look at something in the Gen AI space may say, push pause, I don't want to go through the headache. I'll take the lesser solution that fits in the non-Gen AI category. I'll take the chatbot and be done, as opposed to a more solution that might deliver more benefits to the state.
I do think it's going to be a deterrent, unfortunately. Like, I know that was not the intent of the executive order or any of these actions, but my advice to clients right now is like, generative AI may not be like a good thing to throw at a department because all they're seeing right now is a lot of confusion. We still have these pilots going. We're working on some use cases, some RFI squareds. And now I have this new report I have to do that is just another hurdle in the procurement and contracting process that's already really lengthy and complicated. So never mind. I don't want to deal with it right now.
How do we get two different process. If RFI squared is widely considered uh, just a leadership example on how to do it, define the problem, let the private sector come up with the solution, evaluate the solution, and move forward in a safe environment. But you're moving forward. How do we get that? And then from the same leadership, we get a more restrictive 18-page sign-off process.
It's the paradox of innovation in government, right? Like, you want to innovate. It sounds great. You want to use these new technologies, but at the same time, you're working with public dollars and you're very risk averse. Like, you don't want to screw something up when people's livelihood is on the line. And in many cases, that's absolutely where it comes down. So I do think there is a lot of opportunity. For instance, with these use cases, we have to assume that even in a sandbox, trial, proof of concept type of situation, they're probably already filling out these risk assessments. They're doing that work anyway. So if we come out of one of these proof of concepts with a solution that has already done all the homework, the risk assessment homework, then maybe we're okay. We're like, hey, they've already completed that. We've already checked that box. We'll move forward. 8 other departments want something like this. And so that could be a situation where, like, you do the questionnaire one time, you get your risk assessed of your tool, and then you're good to go. You can sell all over state government. There's a new form that bidders are going to have to fill out that requires disclosure of generative AI solution data sources and a bunch of other factors too. So we knew this was coming, right? The state doesn't want some kind of black box that, magic happens and it comes out the other side. They want to know exactly where the data is coming from. So vendors need to be ready to disclose that. Not all of them want to disclose
Could I do that if I'm using Chat GPT? I hate to use one. I could pick any of the large
Sure.
language models, but do I know if I'm using that, what data sources they were trained on? How do I communicate that to the state, especially if I'm using somebody else's large language model?
Someone has to know at the
Okay.
end of the day. I'm concerned if someone doesn't know, but it's a requirement now. And there will be guidance and disclosures, and scopes of work will have to be updated to include generative AI. But I mean, that's a requirement that people are gonna have to figure out.
Well, when I think about it, when you think about terabytes of data and uploading the contents of the internet, I mean, if I tell you I did that, I really disclosed anything? I used everything that was available on the internet from a machine scraper that was at work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the last 6 months. And even if I could dump all that, what did I tell you?
Right. I mean, this
Like,
reminds me of, I saw a clip the other day where someone tried to pin down a CEO at one of these companies, and they said, well, are you using YouTube data? And she said, yeah, if it's publicly available, we're using it. And it was like, wait a minute, though, that's licensed and trademarked, and you can't use that. And then
Right.
she backpedaled a little bit,
Right.
like, oh no, if it's not, if it isn't free, we haven't executed a licensing agreement, so no, we're not using it.
Right.
And it was sort of like, uh-oh, like, if the CEO doesn't even really know, like, does anyone, to your point? So it's a bit of a concern. You may be able to just say, hey, the LLM under whatever tool I'm using is OpenAI or
Right.
whatever it may be, or ChatGPT 3.5 or
Right.
whatever you're using. I'm not sure, though, that that's going to meet the smell test for the Department of Technology and the decision makers to say definitively, okay, this data being used will not create some type of bias.
Right.
And you have to remember too, like, this is all getting piled on our State Department of Technology for approvals and reviews and risk assessments and keeping catalogs of all the AI projects. These guys are already understaffed. They're overworked. They're stretched super thin. So my concern is, like, are we creating more backlogs for ourselves and for departments that want to use these technologies with these new processes? And I think the answer, hands down, is absolutely we are. Like, who's going to do all of this work?
Right.
Unless we see a BCP come forward for it, which who knows, but we're looking at a huge budget deficit, so it's going to be really difficult.
One of the concerns I have when I look at the regulation is when I go to Hugging Face and you see new language models coming out all the time, are we going to stifle some of those smaller ones because the bigger ones are going to be able to comply with cumbersome regulations or Chat GPT or and again, I don't mean to use a particular one, but everyone's familiar with that one. And so if someone uses a particular large language model and it gets signed off by the department, and now all of a sudden every department says, well, if I just use that one, it's got the approval, but the new one might be better. It might have a better bias indicator. It just may be the 700th most popular language model on Hugging Face. So the department's less familiar with it. And we're
But it's the
not
easy
some
button.
huge market.
Yep.
So they go with the easy button, and then that model gets better or gets more entrenched and gets a leg up. And that, I'm sure that wasn't anyone's intention, but it's often the result of regulation that established players get a stronger foothold.
There was some bright lights in the guidance as well. Each department in state government will have a designated Gen AI lead, and this person has to be among their executive team. It'll probably be your CIO or your chief data officer, someone in that realm. And they also have to have Gen AI teams that are going to be charged with continuous monitoring and evaluation of using generative AI in their departments. So that's really helpful.
That is helpful,
right? Like,
yeah.
we want to know who to call to talk about these different issues. Now we'll have somebody that's designated. So I love that. That's really great. It's just the rest of it that I think we're going to have to just sort of see how it shakes out. My vision is that at some point we'll get to the place where purchasing Gen AI is just like any other purchase, right? We have terms, we have conditions, but it's not overly burdensome. It's not 800 different steps we have to do in an already complicated procurement process. I hope at some point it's just a box we have to check, and then we have enough faith in the use and analysis of these models that we are sure it's not negatively impacting the way that we do business.
That's awfully hopeful. That's awfully hopeful. You hope that the 18-page multi-pronged inspection regime doesn't become the default standard, and it becomes a grinding halt, and we're not the public services are not being improved because it's too difficult to implement the technology.
I mean, although I'll be honest with you, I am hearing about some solutions that are being used in state departments. So a great example that I reviewed the other day, and it looks great, is there is a department that has overlaid a generative AI solution to their HR, manuals, all their IT guidance. Who do I call to get my computer fixed? For state employees. So if I join the Department of whatever, I don't know where any of that stuff is. I don't even know who to call for it. Like, do I call HR? Do I call my admin chief? Do I call IT? So a department has put all of that data into their own closed system, and that department's employees have access to a generative AI model that helps them navigate all of the internal requirements and rules and processes.
I'm familiar with that agency that shall not be named as well. And my first thought was, does this comply? And I'm not an expert
For
on
sure.
all of the internal administrative procedures for doing that, but departments and agencies are famous for making sure they understand what the rules are, and then they will violate a procedure um, on occasion, depending on what the sanctions are and what the consequences are and what the downsides are in navigating between conflict between rules and regulations among state agencies. Not that what people are breaking the law and how do you buy stuff, or I
Right.
mean that's more of the internal process. How often are you supposed to, the kinds of stuff that people get audited
Yep.
for, not law breaking as much as administrative rule breaking that does go on. In your mind, was that particular example consistent with what we're seeing on the rules and the rollout on the implementation, or maybe not?
I think it helps that it is completely internal. Someone asked a question about different permission levels. And like, if I am an analyst, should I be able to see the same stuff that my executive can see? So I think there's still a lot of bumps that need to be figured out in this process. But I do like that one just because you are looking at, it's a closed model and you're looking at data that's only on the state's intranet. So there is the opportunity there to sort of limit what's happening. Um, but at the same time, I mean, look, if government makes something too difficult, what happens? Like, people do, they skirt the rules. It's like an underground economy for Gen AI use in government that could very well happen, where it's like a department's like, they'll never find out. We're just going to buy this and use it because we need it. It'll be helpful. I don't want to go through all those steps. And that's not great either,
Right.
right? Like, if you make it too difficult, people will find a way around it.
Right.
So we should make it fairly painless, in my mind.
I had that with people using their device, and they've got their state computer here and they've got their personal device here, and they're making their life easier on their personal device. And now you don't have the security protections that are on state devices, but they've got similar information right next on their personal device.
Oh, I mean, generative AI is being used everywhere. Like, state devices may have it turned off, but you better believe someone's emailing themselves something to their personal email and using it on their personal computer, because
Right.
it's an incredible tool that makes a lot of people's lives easier. So until government figures it out, are we just not going to benefit from it at all? I mean, it seems a little short-sighted. But at the same time, we want things to be protected and safe and private. So I think we better figure it out, and we better figure it out pretty fast.
It seems like the data and security vendors and the monitoring software people are going to have their services are going to be required in the days ahead.
In short timelines, for sure.
Well, thanks for giving us the update on the ledge and regulatory process. Hopefully it's been useful to our listeners, and another great episode.
Thanks.